Hi, everyone. Welcome to our session on cyber recovery and resilience. I'm Jim Shook. I'm the director for the cybersecurity and compliance practice in the Dell Technologies Data Protection Division. I'm very pleased to have this opportunity to talk about this topic. It's something that I've been very close to over the last 8 years or so, and I look forward to our time together here. Wanted to start with a little bit of background so you know where I'm coming from on these issues. As I mentioned, I started this practice at Dell, actually EMC at the time, about 8 years ago, right after the Sony Pictures attack. We had customers who were concerned about this new type of attack, destroying data, trying to destroy an organization as opposed to just stealing the data. And so we wanted to make sure that we could help them with that process and understand what they needed to do. So we've always been focused on the technology and the controls and the solutions that can make them more cyber resilient and also enable them to efficiently and safely recover cyber recovery from an attack that winds up being successful. And of course, back then, it was just about the data destruction, and over the years became ransomware, and then both, and now double, triple extortion, all those things that come up. To that end, our practice is always also focused on the legal and regulatory issues. So when customers look at these things, they need to solve for the technology issues, but also the business issues. The board wants to know what they have to do. What are the concerns? There are fiduciary responsibilities. There's tricky requirements around when and where you can pay a ransom if you need to. And so we try to bring all of those things together to our customers to help solve for this problem. So let's start with some what I like to call obligatory statistics here. Trying to stay away from the everybody gets attacked all of the time statistics and focus a little bit on things that maybe you haven't run into before. So looking at that second one, a lot of my customers don't understand that if there is what we now term a severe but plausible attack, so something that's high impact, lower probability, but happens more frequently than any of us would like, you're going to have downtime. You can shorten that downtime with some of the things that we'll talk about today and having plans in place, but the average downtime after, probably should term that a successful ransomware attack, unfortunately successful, is 24 days. We've certainly seen situations in the news where the time has been longer, and the tail is much, much longer. So you think about an organization coming back online after a couple of weeks. That doesn't mean everything's back online. It means some of their services are, depending on, again, how broadly the attack was based. But my point being there, we can argue about how long, but these are significant attacks that result in significant downtime, and organizations need to plan for that. The statistic right under that is really interesting to people too. 71% of these malware attacks do not use malware. So if you're looking for malware as your key component of your strategy, you're going to be in trouble. Over 2/3 of the attacks are going to be hands-on keys or using living off the land tools. Doesn't mean that it's not useful, because it is. Let's look for malware and those other capabilities, but understand the bad actors are smart. If they do use malware, it's probably recompiled malware that has a fresh signature hash value never seen before. And again, over 2/3 are not going to use the malware anyway. So important part of the strategy. The last one I'll talk about here is the 2 hours. So that's the breakout time, the time that intruders take from the time they enter the network to starting to try to move laterally, or actually successfully moving laterally. Don't confuse it with dwell time. And in fact, dwell time, I have a lot of people who misunderstand that in terms of the context around ransomware. Back before we had to worry about ransomware and destruction attacks, and it was just about exfiltration, dwell time was getting up to, depends on the survey, 120 days. I saw some that were close to a year. And that was the time in which from which an attacker got into your network and they were located as being in the network. That's the dwell time. They're hiding in secret. Back then, that was the goal, right? They're trying to steal data, and so they can steal more data the longer they're hidden. Once ransomware and destruction came around, the dwell time became far less important. So if you see surveys that are more recent, they often break dwell time into those categories where the impact is exfiltration of data versus the impact being ransomware or destruction. Those attacks tend to be 7 to 10 to 14 days, much, much shorter. So they're starting that pivot on the moving laterally as quickly as they can because they want to get in and get out and get their money. That's an important piece, again, of your strategy to understand that typically the dwell time will be short. I guess I'll talk about one more. So that last one, having a reinfection after the initial cyber attack, 3/4. I think there's a lot of reasons for that. Sometimes organizations are so anxious to recover, they don't do it right. They reintroduce the malware, whether it's immediate or later. Sometimes they don't plug the right holes. If you pay a ransom and you decrypt, the decryptor might have malware in it. There's so many different things. But once an organization has been breached, especially if they've paid the ransom, the bad actors know they can go back and probably do that again. And of course, we always have to remember these are criminals or they're bad actor nation states. They don't play by any rules, so they can say whatever they want, but they're going to do whatever they want. I want to talk about 2 tools before we dive in. And the first one, I'm sure you've seen before, the CIA triad, represents the 3 aspects of data that we try to protect with cybersecurity: confidentiality, integrity, and availability. The confidentiality, of course, being we don't want people who are not authorized to access or steal, download our data. That goes back to kind of traditional attacks that are still there where somebody's exfiltrating secrets or PHI, or more and more now trying to take data out and then extort you, say that they'll publish it if you don't pay them. The second one is the integrity of the data. How can you trust the data is what it's supposed to be? And we don't see a lot of integrity specific attacks where somebody is going and saying changing financial information or inventories, or in the worst case scenarios, getting into healthcare records and changing allergies or blood types or things like that. But we have to think about them, and there certainly are integrity aspects that we have to concern ourselves with when we recover from a successful ransomware destruction attack. And the last one, it really is what's triggered in those attacks, which is the availability. If someone encrypts your data or your systems, they're not available to you, you can't use them. We'll talk about aspects of all these things, but really when we talk about cyber recovery, we're focused on that availability aspect mainly. And one thing I'll point out where this tool has come in handy, many of my clients still think, oh gosh, if I encrypt my data, then it's not susceptible to ransomware because it's already encrypted. Well, not the case. Yes, you're protecting the confidentiality of the data by encrypting it, but it can be re-encrypted, and then that impacts the availability instead. So it helps people to kind of keep those ideas separate. The other tool I wanted to identify, again, one that's well-known, NIST cybersecurity framework, our 5 high-level capabilities: identify, protect, detect, respond, and recover. And if you've been following along, NIST is updating this over the summer and into the fall. We're going to have probably a 6th category around governance and some other changes there too. I bring this up because this is a great framework. Everybody's using it worldwide. My focus today is really on that recover capability. The other things remain important. As I say, if you can stop or limit an attack, you're much better off than if you have to recover from it. You just need to understand that there will be situations where you're going to have to recover, and so you need to be prepared for that. And again, that's our focus for today. Many of my clients like to hear what the analysts are saying. I just have a couple quick quotes here from Gartner that I thought you might find interesting. So this paper, "You Will Be Hacked, So Embrace the Breach," came out a few years ago. It was intended to be somewhat controversial, but Gartner started talking about cyber resilience instead of cybersecurity, understanding that you will be breached, attacks will happen, they'll be successful. So make sure you have the ability to recover and put some focus on it. And the second one, more of a practical advice there. A very powerful thing you can do almost immediately that will enhance your resilience is make your backup mutable. Most storage platforms have some mutable or retention locking capability built into them. Turn that on. it's a great start to your journey. It's not the end point. Unfortunately, you can't just turn that on and say, we're great now. It's just something that's going to elevate your resilience quickly and really start your journey. So let's define what we're talking about. Again, sessions around cyber recovery and cyber resilience, are they the same thing? I don't think of them as the same. Cyber recovery is that capability that really enables the recovery if an attack is successful, where cyber resilience is a bit of a broader umbrella that's going to be more focused on overall business outcomes. We want the business to be resilient so that it can withstand, adapt to, and when necessary, recover from these disruptions. They might be cyber disruptions. They might be cyber-based disruptions where there's adversaries. They might be natural disasters, but being resilient means that you can withstand and recover from those in an efficient amount of time to help protect the business. And to do that, you're going to need a number of tools, or you need to evaluate a number of tools. And I've listed a bunch here. There's no order to these. I like to say, think of these as tools. They're not better than one another. They serve different purpose. If you have a nail, you need a hammer to drive it. If you need to make a hole in the wall, you need a drill. Doesn't make one tool better than the other. It's just what's the purpose of it. So if you think about, I did kind of separate on the left side tools that are more non-adversarial based. So natural disaster, mistakes, natural corruption. Those tools are going to help protect or enable recovery from those situations. The right side is a little heavier on adversarial disruption. So there's a bad actor on the other side. And make no mistake, things like backup and replication and CDP are good for what they're good for. But if you have a cyber actor, they're probably not going to be very useful. Again, it always depends upon the attack and the scope of the attack, but things like CDP and replication are designed to quickly and rapidly replicate data, which in many cases is going to work against you in a ransomware or destruction attack. Similarly, the capabilities are going to help you in cyber attacks, because we have things like isolation and trying to keep that data away, aren't useful or as useful for the non-adversarial, say, DR capabilities, where we need maybe a hot site, right? They're different tools for different purposes. Not everybody will need all of these tools. A lot depends upon the organization's posture for risk and for cyber resilience. You should be aware of them so you can decide whether they make sense for your organization to deploy or review. Kind of a starting point here is making the data center, and I'll refer to it as production and DRs there too, more resilient. And think about that Gartner recommendation. If you just turn on immutability in your production backup, you're going to enhance your cyber resilience. If you have backup and DR, that's going to enhance your resilience from non-adversarial attacks. You already have that. So turn on that immutability, and then that little scope is there to really denote, have some observability into the environment. The cybersecurity team has plenty of tools. They're already looking for, usually, malware by signature or by activity. They have seams to look at baselines of activity and find when things don't seem normal. Might be looking through logs. You might have tools like Splunk, XDR, all of those things, trying to identify and limit bad actor activity. They're really important. We don't want to duplicate those with the tools that we have for resilience, but sometimes tools that are going to help us identify anomalies in our backup environment are going to be useful and complement the tools that the cyber team is using. So for example, you probably don't want your backup to scan for malware when it's making the backup, because you've already got tools that do that. It's just a duplication of the capability. It might not be as good if you're not getting the updates, and it's going to take more compute and slow down your backup infrastructure. But if you can report on some anomalies, like maybe backups aren't completing, maybe they're much smaller than usual, much larger than usual. Those are things that the cyber team isn't going to pick up on, that whether they're caused by an adversarial or non-adversarial disruption, you're going to want to know about. Let me give you an example. If a bad actor gets in undiscovered and logs into the backup as an administrator, if the cyber team didn't catch them getting in, it's going to be hard for them to catch them logging in because they're going to have administrator credentials and they're probably going to obfuscate where they're coming in from. If they go in and say modify backup policies, maybe they just turn them off. Again, not something the cyber team may pick up on. But if I'm monitoring my backup infrastructure, I'm going to know that backups aren't completing, or they're much smaller than these, or much larger. And again, whether that was caused by a mistake or by an adversary, doesn't really matter. If I've got a warning on it, I'm going to be more resilient and I can go check that out and fix it. So that's really what we're talking about there. That anomaly alerting, again, mostly complementary to what the cyber team is doing. And there's a whole bunch of different tools and capabilities out there for you to evaluate. I just want to make sure we're talking to, it is both adversarial and non-adversarial. It's really just a focus on backup infrastructure is the purpose of those things. And that will also help make sure that we're not overlapping too much with the cyber team. That is not our endpoint. So if we do those things, that's a great start. We're going to be more resilient. When you look at the best practice recommendations from around the globe, and here's a sample, they focus on, for ransomware specifically, having another copy of data, sometimes called tertiary copy, that is disconnected or not connected or offline or air-gapped. And we have a vocabulary problem in this space that nobody seems to define their terms very well. So you get a situation where we're using the same term, but often it has 3 or 4 different meanings depending on who you talk to. Of this group, Sheltered Harbor, which is a financial services initiative founded by US banks and financial institutions, has a really great standard that goes into some detail on what it means to what they call an air gap, which is, we probably term more isolation, but it's that separation. We'll talk a little bit more about what those things mean. But my point is that having that immutability and observability is going to make you more resilient if you want to be following best practice, which of course, from a regulatory standpoint, you get recommendations, then you get nudges, then you get requirements, then you get lawsuits. These things are going to grow over time into more of a requirement than a recommendation. You need to look at that disconnected and that isolated capability. We've tried to be very careful in defining what we mean by isolation. You'll hear people in the industry say, well, I've just got an extra copy. It's off the LAN. It's off of the backup infrastructure. It's not it's segmented. It's in the cloud. Those are strategies. They're not isolation. They're just an extra copy somewhere. When we talk about isolation, the simple way to look at it is, if you're a bad actor, you just can't get there. You can't impact the data or the components that are being protected because they're isolated. I like to think of it as having 2 paths. One's a data path and one's a control plane or a management path. And you'll see some of these concepts in NIST 800-209 if you've ever looked at that, the isolation section, which is really interesting read. But if you have data in a data center, data in a public cloud, you've got to be able to access it. You've got to be able to manage it. So can the bad actors. If they get in, they've got access. If you create what we would call a vault, and for us, that vault isn't an immutable hardened backup. The vault is isolated. That isolation means that normally it's inaccessible. So you see that dashed line there. It's a non-persistent data path. When we bring up the data path so that we can update copies, we're only bringing up the data path. We're doing it from that vault side so that it's not accessible, and there's never a control path in. So if you think about it from a technical standpoint, if I'm a bad actor and I try to get into that vault, there's no SSH, there's no HTTPS, things that would be control or management type commands. Just there's nothing there. Listening to them, they're not allowed, they're dropped. There's no way around it. You have to physically have access to those components to change them. And that's really what the isolated piece is about. If you tie all these things together, you've got on the left there, that resilient solution that we talked about before. That will help you in smaller cases, and even in larger attacks, some of that infrastructure may be available and untouched. but you need to consider putting something, and we'll talk about what that something is, in that separate vaulted environment. And you want something that helps you to operate that on an autonomous basis, so you don't have to worry about going in there. If you're accessing it from the production side, you don't have isolation. So having those tools in there, being able to test data and analyze data, make sure that the integrity is good, along with monitoring and reporting, so that you know what's going on there without having to access it. You're going to use all of those things to recover if the production environment gets impacted. That's the whole purpose behind all of that. And this tracks to 800.209. So, think here, the design should strive to achieve a state where the copies could not be impacted by anything. And when I think about my friends at Sheltered Harbor, they have a similar requirement, which is essentially if the bad actor is in the production environment, fully compromised, has access to everything, passwords and knowledge and keys and everything else, they still can't impact that Sheltered Harbor data vault. We follow those same concepts. That's going to give you the most security for what's there. I talked a little bit about what generically we might refer to as analytics in this industry space. And I like to think of them in two different categories. And there's nuances in there, but high level, you've got things in the production environment separate from cybersecurity tools that are going to alert you to anomalies. We talked about those in the backup world, things that you might be looking for. Different from that, we want to validate the integrity of the data. And that's particularly important for copies of data that we have in that isolated vault, because we can't go in there on a regular basis, or we don't want to go in on a regular basis and test them. So tools that can look at that data, understand, and this is the key, we're not looking for malware, understand whether it's been modified or corrupted by malware or by bad actors is the key there. Essentially, we know that it's good for recovery. And if it's not, we need to know that ahead of time so that we can take steps to either go back to older copies or fix it or whatever the case may be. But that's the key, and that's the key difference. So looking at things that are happening in the production environment, which might indicate bad actor activity, separate from validating the integrity of the data so that we know we can use it for recovery. And as I said, a lot of nuances there. That activity, are you looking for actual bad actor activity? Are you looking for malware? Are you looking for too many modifications? All those kinds of things fall under that larger umbrella. What goes into that vault? So this is harder than we thought when we started this practice for organizations to decide. We've always talked about putting critical applications in the vault, maybe 20 to 30% of the total footprint. That's proven to be hard. Organizations have a difficult time identifying the critical applications and prioritizing them. So we've kind of taken that step back and said, look, build out that resilience that we talked about before and create a vault that's a starter vault, an isolated vault, populate it with what we would call tier 0 capabilities as an initial starting point. So what's tier 0? It's really kind of base pavement that applications are going to need to run. Got a list there. It's not inclusive, but things like AD, DNS, maybe gold copies, things that you know you're going to need to help rebuild. It's not the actual business applications, but the things that they're going to ride on top of. Easy to do. It's a small amount of data. It's going to make a world of difference if you have to recover from a severe but plausible attack, to have those components ready to go and know that they've been secure because they've been isolated. Then over time, you may add other applications. So tier 1 applications, these are the critical things I've talked about before, often based on or aligned to revenue, reputation, systematic risk, or safety. That's usually what we see when we talk to our clients about those things. You don't have to get a complete list and rate them in terms of importance, at least not yet. There's an initiative in England the banks have had to go through where they've had to identify their key business services. Think about the level like providing credit card services to customers, and then identifying the applications that are required to deliver those services. And now they're going to go through the process of protecting those to meet their what they call impact tolerances, which is kind of what we're talking about here in terms of recovery. But you don't have to do all of that work today if you're not one of those banks. Get an app that everybody knows is critical. Get it in the vault. What is it? Database, got load balancers, front end, web, whatever those components might be, get those in the vault. It's going to make your recovery process simpler. Over time, you may add other tier 1 applications. If you're really looking at these capabilities, you might add lower tier applications. And then also, again, depending on your journey, you have to look at being more mature in your recovery processes. So essentially speeding those up if you need those. You're just going to be better at what you do. You're going to have people who are more knowledgeable, and you may have things like clean rooms and landing zones that are going to shorten your recovery time, because you don't have to wait for incident response to identify what happened in production and cleanse it and make sure there's no persistence before you can actually start the recovery. You're going to have alternative sites or mechanisms that are going to let you do it right away. That can get complex. It can get expensive, but it's workable, and it's really the organization's decision to make. Do I want to spend the time and effort on those other capabilities to shorten my recovery? Is it worth it to me? So again, for some of my customers, being down for hours costs millions of dollars. For others, not as much. That's kind of the trade-off that the organization can make and make that decision. One last thing to kind of tie all these pieces together, get the question all the time, how long will it take me to recover? And the answer, it depends. And that's not satisfying to anybody. So we try to kind of map out what these recovery processes look like, how long they might take, depending on how much work you've done up front in preparation. If you just have basic data protection, so backup, if you have a severe but plausible event, it's going to be months. Think about that statistic before, the 24 days. There's plenty of public record information where organizations took months to recover. That's usually basic data protection. It takes a while to understand what happened, to bring systems back up so that you can access them. You may have to rebuild. There's just a lot of work, and it can be months. If you just do what Gardner said, turn on that immutability in your backup, you're going to be better. So instead of months, maybe it's weeks to months. You're going to take a lot of risk out. Still going to be a while, because there's still a lot of work that has to be done, testing and other work to get to that immutable data, depending again on the attack. But you can see where you're starting to move to be better. If you do all the things that I said and do that immutability plus that critical rebuild, you're going to get days to weeks pretty quickly out of that. So you've got the ability to get started more quickly, with more certainty, with less risk. And then if you really are an organization that needs to be hours to days instead of days to weeks, then you have to look at those fully mature vaulting capabilities. You need more in the vault. You need to consider things like clean rooms and landing zones and those other capabilities that are going to shorten what you do. But again, this is a journey. It's going to be something that happens over time. You need to walk before you can run. You're kind of on this process of pushing to the right or to the left until you get to the point where you need to be. So I hope that's helpful. Really appreciate the time you spent with me today. If you have feedback or just want to connect, I'm jim.shook, SHOOK, @dell.com. Would also appreciate it if you take a moment to rate this session. Again, thank you so much.